Some of you might know that a few weeks ago we were in New Zealand, and I happened to be in Wellington, and I was visiting with a church. In fact, it's the first church in New Zealand called St. Paul's Church in Wellington, and it's their first church, and it's a different type of church because it's actually all made of timber. You know, New Zealand being a earthquake-prone country, so they make a lot of their structures out of timber those days. And when we went inside there was a guide there who asked us to go and have a look at that nice big LED light window, and he was saying that that's the road to Damascus. So I went and had a look at it. The four of us, we all went and had a look at it, and I just cannot see how it is. How is it that it can be the road to Damascus? In fact, if I blow it up, right, it is actually the Good Samaritan. So there's a guide there who knows a lot about the church, and like he's not a young man, he's an older man, and he was telling us about how beautiful the church was and the LED lights, and it's the road to Damascus. And I kept thinking, it's not the road to Damascus. It is the Good Samaritan. In fact, the one on the very left tells about the Samaritan, the man being beaten up. The second one actually shows a horse and this man, the Jewish guy beaten up. And then the second one in the middle, actually, there's a horse there, and this man was putting this Samaritan was putting the man up onto the horse. And the third panel actually shows the man in bed being looked after, and you can see a man up there with some money in it, so giving the money to the innkeeper. So when I was leaving the church, I was thinking to myself, should I tell that man that it is not the road to Damascus? But I didn't. I left. I let him keep going on. But anyway, so that's why I prompted me to do a lesson on the Good Samaritan. And it's actually arguably one of the best known parables of Jesus. In fact, even non-Christians, non-believers know of this story of the Good Samaritan, even though they may not know the details. You hear about it in the newspaper sometime when someone does something that's good for the other. They'll report it as the Good Samaritan. So this morning, I just wanted to go through a passage at a time and look at, for us, 3 points. 3 points for us. So the passage starts at Luke chapter 10, verse 25. And we read this, and Luke records this, and he says, "And behold, a certain lawyer." Now, the term lawyer used there is more an expert in the law, right? When you say expert in the law, it's expert in the Old Testament, the old law, right? A certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" So the mere fact that this lawyer is trying to test Jesus means that he's not really asking a sincere question, right? It was not because he's sincerely trying to ask him, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Just like many of the religious leaders in those days, they're suspicious of Jesus and they're searching for a way to trap him. And that's why he's saying he's tested him, right? Nevertheless, I guess the question is an important question for us as well. Even today, the question applies to all of us. What shall I do to inherit eternal life? So instead of answering him, Jesus asked the man a question in reply, and he said to him, "What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? Of which the man answered. So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So that's a correct answer. In fact, when Jesus was asked the same question another time in Matthew chapter 25, Matthew chapter 22, verse 35 to 40, we read of this. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Here, this lawyer was asking about the great commandment. And Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus said this, On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So this is a sum of God's love. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what this is all about. Christianity is about. It's about loving God and loving your neighbor and yourself. Now, this in verse 29, we did this. Actually, verse 28, Jesus said, You have answered rightly, do this and you will live. But this expert in the law wanted to justify himself. He said, but he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, Who is my neighbor? What does it mean to justify? To justify is to be declared innocent, to be found not guilty, to have met the standard of righteousness. So this lawyer, this expert in the law, wanted to be justified, and he asked Jesus for a clarification on who his neighbor is. So, to answer that, Jesus responded by telling him a parable, and that's where we read from verse 30 onwards. Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. You know, the trip from Jerusalem to Jericho is one that a lot of the Jewish people travel. It is only about 27 kilometers long. It goes from Jerusalem downhill all the way to Jericho. It is in fact known as the Way of Blood. The Way of Blood, because it goes through a lot of barren mountains, over a lot of rough terrain with caves and large boulders, where a lot of robbers would hide in order to rob the travelers. And this is precisely what happened to this man in the parable. He is beaten up and left for dead, leaving him half dead. Right. But then we had two men walking past. It says, by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. So two men walked by. One of them, a priest. The priest is a servant of God. He is a servant of God who offers sacrifices in the for the Jewish people in the temple. And then you have a Levite. A Levite are also people who serve in the temple, and they assist the people, but they all serve in the temple. In fact, some of them, the priests and the Levites, are responsible for distributing the handouts to the poor. But The main thing about these two people are that they are people who knows of the law. They know of the Old Testament passages about loving your neighbor and loving mercy and doing justice to those who are suffering. Nevertheless, both men, instead of stopping to help, intentionally crossed onto the other side of the path to walk by the injured man. So the question is, why? Why would they pass? Why would they pass by? And some of these questions, the answer to this question sometimes applies to us as well. Why would these two guys pass by an injured man who is lying half dead on the road? They could be passing by because contamination. They could have thought that perhaps the man is dead. You know, in those days, the Jewish people are not allowed to be in contact with a dead person, right? Because if they do, it was going to cause them a lot of inconveniences. They would have to be ceremonially unclean. They would have to be clean again in order for them to be fit for service, right? Or they went past them because of safety. You know, they were afraid that it might be a trap, you know, for their own safety. And then they might have gone past because they don't want to be entangled, right? Maybe it's just too complicated to get involved. It would delay their journey. They're going from Jerusalem to Jericho on a business, you know, delay their journey. It's best to leave the man and hope that someone else would help that man. Leave it to someone else. You know, it happens to a lot of us too in our daily lives. Sometimes we come across somebody who needs help. We look and we say, well, it's going to cost me a lot of inconvenience. It's going to cost me a lot of, it might be, it might not be safe for me. I know a couple of months ago, we happened to witness an accident. An older lady decided to do a U-turn in front of the tram, and the tram collected the car. And luckily, the lady was all right. The car was basically written off. So, but for a while, no one ran to the lady to help, and I was quite surprised because I didn't actually see the accident. We heard the bang and turned around and saw what happened. Uh, no one went there. So you know, we ran across the road and helped her and found out that she was all right and stayed with her and all that. But it was just surprising to me that it was on a Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were cars going around, people going around, and nobody actually did anything. But so the police came, the fire engine came, the ambulance came, and everything. But she was all right. So that could be some of the reason why people don't want to get involved. You know, they could think that it's going to be inconvenience them. It's going to take them a lot of time. It's going to be they don't want to get involved. It could be very complicated. It may not be safe for them. But whatever the reason, the priest and the Levite passed on. And Jesus said this, but a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. That's the first thing that we need to notice. He saw and he had compassion. You know, that is the instigator for us to do something. When we see something and go past, it's probably because we do not have compassion. The Samaritan saw and he had compassion. And because of that, what did he do? He went to him, bandaged his wound, poured on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. He probably would be tearing out his own garments to use to bandage him, his own wine, his own oil as balm, and then he put the injured man on his own donkey, on his own animal, which means he himself would have to walk, isn't it? And then he brings the man to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." 2 denarii is actually 2 days worth of work. That's how much he paid to the innkeeper, right? Certainly, when you read this, you realize that the length that this Samaritan goes to for a complete stranger is impressive, isn't it? Pretty impressive. And it is even more impressive when you understand that the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. And in turn, they also hated the Jews in return, right? The Samaritans are, in fact, descendants of the Jews who had intermarried with non-Jewish people, and the Jewish people considered them to be half-breeds, and because they take their religion and blend it with pagan practices. In fact, in John chapter 8, verse 48, when the Pharisees were trying to insult Jesus, right? They said to him, then the Jews answered and said to him, "Do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Just to try to insult Jesus. That's what they use. So the Jews hated the Samaritan and they looked down upon them. So Jesus asked the question then in verse 36. He says, "So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." See, the lawyer, the expert in the law, right, could not even bring himself to say the Samaritan, because the Jewish people hate the Samaritans that much, right? He said the one who showed mercy on him. So Jesus' point is this, is that loving a man, loving his neighbor means loving like the Samaritan in the story. To be willing to inconvenience yourself, to be willing to risk your own safety, and to be willing to bear the cost for anyone who is in need, even your enemy. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. So, I want to share with you 3 points this morning. The first point is that Jesus set a higher standard. Remember how Luke put it? He said, the lawyer wanted to justify himself, and he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" He was hoping that Jesus would say, "You need to treat your fellow Israelites kindly. You need to look after them." He was hoping that Jesus was going to give him an answer that is achievable, that he would let him believe that he would have met God's experience. That's how we are sometimes when we do something. We want to have it justified. We look for ways to justify ourselves. Instead, what Jesus said was, what Jesus did was he set a really high bar. Jesus said that you must be willing to be inconvenienced, you must be willing to risk your own safety, and you must be willing to bear the cost for anyone who is in need. That's what we need to do. That's what your neighbor is. And even if they are your enemy. You know, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 48, Jesus said this, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, so this is what Jesus is doing now. He is setting a higher standard. You know, the thought of the time with the Jewish people is that you love your neighbor because they are your own people. But Jesus said you love your neighbor, and hate your enemy. But Jesus said you love your enemies as well. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good and send rain to the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the standard that Jesus set, to be perfect. Perfect. He raised the bar to such a high level. You know, despite all our efforts, we are never going to be able to get up to such a high standard, isn't it? Love your enemies as well. That's what we all feel like. Love your neighbors, but hate your enemies. But Jesus' standard is more. Love your neighbors and love your enemies as well. But here's the good news. The good news is this, that Jesus has met the standard for us in his love, for God and for us. Remember, the question was, who is my neighbor? The question set by the lawyer. Who is my neighbor? The answer that Jesus gave was, which one was a neighbor? What is the neighborly thing that was done? In other words, who is acting in a neighborly way? The law expert wanted to find out who. Jesus said it's what you do that makes you a neighbor. If you think about it, if the roles were to be reversed, for instance, if Jesus said there was a Samaritan that was beaten up and a Jewish guy who walks around and saw the Samaritan beaten up and helped the Samaritan, that would be just somebody caring for somebody, isn't it? But it's not. Jesus deliberately made it the Jewish man that was beaten up. He made it so that people will focus on the Samaritan, someone who is an enemy. It's about someone who is seen as an enemy and someone who owes you nothing. And yet, this person is willing to sacrifice his time, his effort, and his money to help you as an act of mercy and grace. You know, think about it. The Samaritan don't owe the Jewish man anything. In fact, from the Samaritan's point of view, the Jewish man is his enemy. Why would he stop and look after him and take care of him? So, to answer the question, who is my neighbor. My neighbor is everyone. My neighbor is someone who needs help, right? Someone who owes. The story is about what happens when someone who owes you nothing sacrifices himself for you as an act of mercy and grace. That's what neighborly act is about. But Jesus met the standard for us. Jesus did not just inconvenience himself when he left his throne in heaven to come down and suffer and die on the cross for us. Jesus was willing to risk, not just willing to risk his own safety. He laid down his life for us, dying in our place, taking the punishment that we deserve while we were still his enemies. You look at that story of the Good Samaritan. We are not that Good Samaritan. We are that person that was beaten up. Jesus was the Good Samaritan. That's what Jesus did for us. In Romans chapter 5, verse 6 to 10, that Jiong read for us earlier, the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, tells us this. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than, having now been justified by his blood. There's the word justified. Made innocent. We are now made innocent by his blood. We shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So we are not the Good Samaritan. We are the man that is bleeding on the road, left for dead, in need of mercy. And we have been saved at a great cost by one who you had offended, even though we deserve to be left for dead. That's what Christ did for us. He perfectly lived God's law, died on the cross to pay for the penalty for our inability to measure up, so that all who willingly put on Christ, there is forgiveness and a way to be right with God. And the third point that I want to go is this. Jesus answered and said, "Go and do likewise." That's what we need to do as well. Go and love like Jesus loved. And that's the true point of this parable. We are that man lying on the road. Jesus, in his mercy, saved us at a great cost to himself. And now, what do? We can only apply this lesson to our lives. We need to go and love like Jesus loved. We want to do that not to gain his approval, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because we have been loved and we have been saved. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16 to 18. The Apostle John tells us this. By this we know love. How? because he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brothers in need and shut up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. That's what we are to do. Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. So my conclusion this morning is this. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Everyone. Everyone that is in need, we can see everyone that we need. Everyone that we can meet, that whose needs we can meet. Even my enemy. That's who my neighbor is. Everyone that's in need, whose need you can see and whose need you can meet. Even my enemy. There is no limits to neighborly love. So, my prayer this morning is this. Let us love as we have loved. Christ came down from his throne in heaven. He willingly gave up his position in heaven. He willingly came down knowing that he is going to go to the cross. That's how much he loved us. And that's how much we need to love our brethren as well.